let's switch now to the other piece of surprising news this week, which was the Washington Post story about Mitt Romney's time in a prep school in Michigan, in which he does not come out very favorably. There is this one important anecdote about where he rounded up a group of boys and set upon a classmate whose hair he didn't like, was too long. The Post suggests that he was at some level known or not known as potentially being gay. Romney, while the other kids held him down, cut his hair according to this incredibly detailed piece. What do you make of it? Does it matter? What does it tell us? What does it tell us in the context of this campaign?
Well, clearly it's a bad story for the Romney campaign, and it underscores this narrative that the Obama campaign is trying to present, that Romney's out of touch, he's back, he's from the 50s, he's kind of this Leave It to Beaver type of character who just doesn't understand the. If the Obama campaign slogan is forward, he's looking backwards. But I do think, like, if we look back at what we were doing in high school and can extrapolate that at all to what we are at this point today, I don't think many people looking at that story and looking at what happens. I mean, they'll look at it for some interesting anecdotes, but I ultimately don't think people are going to look at what he did in high school 50 years ago and say this has much to do with how he would govern as a president.
Right, and also it doesn't seem like there's a. I mean, part of what was interesting about this story for a lot of people is it seemed so surprising. I mean, he was a guy of hijinks and all of that, but this is, you know, he's the bully in this case. I mean, he's not just a cut-up, he's cutting up the guy's hair.
Right, the story presents him as the ringleader, basically, in this whole plot to cut the guy's blonde hair, which was hanging in his face or something like that. I do agree with Josh that generally this is not a good story for the Romney campaign, but I don't think many voters are going to use this when they go to the polls next November. I do think it's, for the most part, respectable journalism to put that kind of stuff out there. Goodness knows people have gone much deeper into the president's past, surfacing photos and all kinds of things during the 2008 campaign.
Right, and Aaron, what do you make of, I mean, part of the problem for Romney here also is that he's undefined in some senses, and although we know him, but in terms of general election context, he's trying to improve his story. He's got very low favorable numbers, and this does come at a time where he'd rather be telling his warm stories about the 1950s and not have this one in there.
And I think one of the major impacts that lengthy Republican primary has had is that the Obama campaign, even before they started voting, had been kind of defining Romney as the rich guy, the out-of-touch guy, the guy who doesn't know what you think or how you feel. And I think that this story feeds into that a little bit. And it's, if nothing else, even if people aren't necessarily going to look at this and say, oh, Romney's a bad guy for something he did 30, 40 years ago, they may look at it and say, you know, this is a guy who, or rather, this is somebody who I don't know anything about, but this is the one thing that I do know about him, and he hasn't had a chance really to come forward and define himself for that general election.
I think the bigger problem for Romney is how his campaign and how he, in particular, responds to these types of stories. You saw him just the other day in Colorado when he was asked about marijuana. And usually it's a question that a good presidential candidate can brush off and joke about. I know he wants to talk about the economy, but he's got to know he's going to get other questions. And the fact that he can't brush off these kind of stories that aren't particularly favorable, he can't automatically refocus himself without looking irritated. That Bret Baier interview, I can't forget, from the primary campaign.
Right.
It was a friendly interview, and he just got really, really upset when he was scrutinized on some basic questions. So I think it's a real test for Romney and his campaign to show him that he's above a lot of these small, nitpicky things and can focus on the economy.
I mean, suffice to say, Romney is not translated to a general election candidate very smoothly. I mean, the guy's basically been running in a Republican primary for president since 2004 in many ways, and he just has not made that transition to be able to speak to independent voters. But there's still a lot of time. This is pretty early out on the campaign trail. I think what will be interesting is to see what kind of arsenal the Obama campaign has come up with him in terms of opposition research, because his opponents in the primary did not have the staff or the organization to really research his background and get a lot of oppo out on Romney.
Well, it's a good point. This week, Governor Romney, in an interview the day before he went to Michigan, when he was in Ohio, said about the car bailout that he took a lot of credit for it. Now, we can remember that Governor Romney was against the bailout at first. He was for bankruptcy, which the car companies ultimately went through. The administration says, though, that they never would have been able to get to the bankruptcy had there not been the bailout, because they would have collapsed beforehand and imploded, and so would the whole car industry. Aaron, a lot of credit for the car. I mean, he can claim credit for writing an op-ed, but that seemed to be also just kind of off the beam.
I tend to think with this stuff, and I'm not going to, I think our fact checker at the Washington Post judged his statement about this and said that it gave it 3 Pinocchios, which is a pretty high rating for it not being true. I think, though, that he has enough of a relationship to this issue, and he was out front on the bankruptcy stuff, enough to the point where he can kind of obfuscate this issue, which could potentially be harmful to him in a state like Michigan or in the Midwest. And so I think that as long as he can kind of make that case to people and have a somewhat believable case to be made, then I think maybe he can not pay that price that he otherwise might have after, in the Michigan primary, we're talking about him being against the bailout.
Do we think we're going to be talking about this bailout for the next 6 months? Because while he was having to talk about it in Ohio and then kind of not talk about it in Michigan, the president's ads, the 25 million ads he runs, the exhibit A of his economic program is that the car industry's back, and then after it says the car industry's back, it says the president believed in us, he trusted us, sort of this argument to the middle class that he's got your back. It feels like we're just going to be going back and forth over this issue for the next 6 months.
Yeah, I think it'll be an indicative topic. I think we'll talk about it a lot. I think we'll talk about it more than the haircut Mitt Romney gave one of his classmates in high school or middle school. I think it's an important issue. We should talk about it. What I look at going down the road is which states this matters in. And it matters in Ohio, it matters a little bit in Indiana, it matters in Michigan, these Rust Belt states. So let's assume Republicans, let's just for the sake of argument, are going to take Indiana, and then Ohio is the battleground state. At what point does Romney just completely divorce himself from Michigan and say, I'm not going to win there, and just not even try to play that at all?
Because they pretend, in much the way the Obama campaign says that Arizona's on the map, they say Michigan's on the map in the Romney campaign.
And they believe it. And one thing that really I find remarkable about the auto bailout issue, if you talk to Democratic pollsters, and many who did races in that part of the country in 2010, it was actually a very winning issue for Republicans.
Yeah.
And there was an ABC News Washington Post poll just out today that actually shows the country's pretty divided on the auto bailout, especially among independents. So it's a winning issue for the president, but I'm surprised Romney is so defensive about it. I'm surprised he doesn't use it to pivot to other issues, raise questions about government spending and bailouts and so on, because the auto bailout in and of itself is mildly popular. It's a winning issue for Obama, but the overall theme of overspending and bailouts in general is a winning issue for Romney. So I'm surprised he comes out so defensively on this issue specifically.
And also in Ohio, where the Democrats think the car bailout's going to help people kind of attach their improving economy to the president, there was that Quinnipiac poll this week where they asked people who's responsible for the good economy in Ohio. 68% said the governor, who's got a really 38% approval rating. Terrible approval rating. They give him the credit, not the president.